Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Judy Greenspan, the Director of Public Programs here at the Center for Jewish History. And I'm just curious if I could see a show of hands. For whom is this a first visit tonight? Oh, how nice. Oh, this is great. Well, good. So welcome to the new people and welcome back to the others who have been here before. What? Even louder. How's this? Good? All right, is this loud enough? Okay, all right, good. So on behalf of our partner organization, the Leo Baeck Institute, I'm very pleased to welcome you to tonight's program with Michael Simonson. Michael is an archivist and the director of public outreach at the Leo Baeck Institute, and this evening he will share one of the many wonderful stories he's discovered in the LBI collections over the years. He calls the one you're going to hear tonight, Paint, Pray, Love, his title, and you're about to be treated to the adventurous tale and enchanting art of the 20th century German Jewish artist Lene Schneider-Kainer. So I'd like to take a moment to thank Michael for the work, knowledge, and tremendous enthusiasm that he poured into tonight's program. I'd also like to thank Laura Postian, LBI's registrar and collection care manager, for her time and valuable input, as well as Renata Evers, LBI's director of collections. And finally, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to a special guest in our audience tonight. Lene Schneider-Kainer's great-grandson, Fade Kainer, is here. So that's pretty nice. So I'm just curious, are people here already familiar with Lene Kainer-Schneider's art? Is anybody? Okay, so you're in for a good story. Paint, Pray, Love is the third program in our new series that we're calling Out of the Box. And have any of you been to either of the previous two? One was about the gay Jewish bullfighter from Brooklyn, and the other about the Kullback family from Germany. So those are two that we've had already. And the idea behind the series is to showcase the remarkable treasures and stories tucked away in the tens of thousands of boxes housed here at the Center for Jewish History. That there are tens of thousands of boxes may come as a surprise to those of you who are in our audience for the first time. So before we begin, I'd like to say a few words about this remarkable institution. To me, the Center for Jewish History is both a New York City gem and a somewhat hidden treasure. It's a renowned research institute for scholars of Jewish history, and the center is also a destination for public programs, conferences, concerts, exhibitions, genealogy research, and most importantly, all of this is because the center is home to our 5 partner organizations and their extraordinary archival collections. Our partners are the American Jewish Historical Society, the American Sephardi Federation, the Leo Baeck Institute, the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, and Yeshiva University Museum. Together, they possess the largest repository of Jewish archival material outside of Israel. So a lot of people passing by the center have been known to remark that it looks like a little post office. And I would say that those people probably have no idea that inside here is this astonishing treasure trove of materials that span 5,000 years of history and include millions of documents, hundreds of thousands of books, thousands of artworks, photographs, ritual objects, recordings, sheet music, posters, and more. So in other words, the Center for Jewish History is quite literally a building filled to the brim with stories. And to give you a glimpse of what that, there we go, oops. Huh. What did I just do? Where's that? Can you get me back? Well, to give you a glimpse in 2 seconds of what that actually looks like, which I've just screwed up. I've got to go back. No, never mind. Well, there it is, right there. Yeah, something always has to go wrong. Sorry about that. Okay, there you go. This is just part of one partner's archives. This belongs to HHS in a 12-story building behind this one. So you see shelf after shelf filled with boxes that contain stories like the one you'll hear tonight. And the contents of these boxes are organized and sorted by the center community archivists, and in the process, their remarkable stories are discovered, preserved, and shared. So as you can read in your program, and much more so on their website, LBI was founded in 1955, and theirs is an archive focused on the history of German-speaking Jews. The Lene Schneider-Kainer collection was donated in 1967, and when Michael Simonson came to LBI 17 years ago, he discovered the story he's telling this evening when he translated Lena's diary from German to English. It was a fascinating project and one Michael was well prepared for, having studied German history and German language before attending the Pratt Institute for Archival Studies. So finally, the stories collected and saved in this building are not meant to be hidden away. Preserving history, telling our stories, looking to the past in order to better understand the present are central to our mission, and Out of the Box is another way to share the immense resources housed at the center. In addition, you can spend hours or maybe years browsing through our online collections. Our reading room, library, and genealogy institute are all open to the public. Exhibitions, public programs, conferences draw from and showcase the stories in this building. So on your way out, please sign up for our mailing list, pick up flyers of upcoming programs, and we hope you'll come back again and often. Michael will take questions at the end of the program, so please hold your questions until then, and we will conclude the evening with a small reception. So now, at last, paint, pray, love. Please join me in welcoming Michael Simonson.
So good evening and welcome to my talk tonight about Lene Schneider-Kainer. Little known, actually, a German Jewish artist, born in Vienna. She lived her life in Berlin in the 1920s, and then she embarked in a trip of a little over 2 years throughout Asia, following the path of Marco Polo, which is very interesting because now we don't even know if he was a real person. So following the route that it was written, he took. I'm first going to begin by talking about how I became involved and discovered the story of Lene Schneider-Kainer, referred to simply as Lina. I started here in 2002 as an intern in the library, and then I was later hired to work in the archives. I knew the story about Lina and her trip and her artwork largely through some very basic reference questions and through digital projects at work. But I knew very little, but I was very interested, partly because it was very vibrant artwork, partly because it seemed like such an unusual story in the world of German Jewish Kaffee and Kuchen to leap up and take a trip across Asia, especially as a woman. And I also learned that there were things that are not in our collection that also made the story even more interesting. There was a diary, there's a scrapbook of her trip, and there's over 400 artworks that she made while on this trip that we have. And there were more. I think they're sometimes at other museums, other people's private collections. I also see them on eBay and Heritage and auction houses. So they're out there and people purchase them. We have had a series of digital projects at the Leo Baeck Institute. And as part of those projects, we decided to digitize much of the artwork of Lina. So with other staff members, I found myself going in back into the archives, into the art collection as well, and going through the boxes and shelves that contain the artwork and the diary and the scrapbook. And on first opening the boxes, I was really amazed by the bright watercolors, very vibrant, the clothes, the jewelry, and very much the eyes, actually. And this is my own personal feeling, is that the eyes were very alive to me, for lack of a better word, and it was as if they were coming kind of out of the darkness, out of the past, to look at me or to live again. And I thought that was interesting because, of course, we don't know the stories of most of the people she painted. Everyday lives of people in the 1920s across the continent of Asia and in the near Middle East. There is a diary. It's in German. I had skimmed the diary, but in my work, I had no reason to read the diary, and the diary remained largely unread by me. At this point, I need to talk about this woman here on the left, Ruth Hyman. We have a number of volunteers at the Leo Baeck Institute. Many of them work translating material from German to English. Ruth was from Nuremberg, and she had escaped Germany on a Kindertransport, and her parents had not gotten out. So she was very happy to volunteer for us, and she volunteered many years, but she always said, because of what happened, she didn't want to translate anything about the Holocaust. So we have a lot of material not about the Holocaust, actually, despite what people might think. Perhaps most of it is not about that. And so I gave her the diary, and Ruth really enjoyed translating the diary. She would come up to me during the working day. She'd tell me kind of salacious things Lena had said, descriptions. Lena was not scared to talk about sex and gender. That was very interesting for Ruth. And Ruth really enjoyed working on it. This is a picture of her with her niece, by the way, who lives here in New York as well. Sadly, Ruth died before she could finish translating the diary, and the translation was completed by Irene Miller, who's here tonight in the audience. So I want to thank Irene for finishing this project. So with the diary translated, it was made more accessible. The translation was put online. I also now knew a lot about what was in the diary. I knew a lot about her trip. So I began to do more research. I also, for many years, I thought of contacting the family, and I even kind of found them online, but I didn't contact them for many years because it just seems very weird. Then I had this excuse of this talk, so then I finally did it. So I'll now begin to tell the story, actually, of Lena herself and this trip, and her life, and through her whole life. So Lena was many things. As it says here, she was a painter, an illustrator, a fashion designer, and she was a socialite. She was born in 1885 in Vienna to Jewish parents. Her mother was a convert, actually. She had not been born Jewish, but had converted. Her father was an artist in his own right. He was a painter, and he was largely known as a book illustrator. His name was Sigmund Schneider. She became interested in art, but at this time, women were not allowed, as a general rule, to study art in any of the European art academies. But through the influence of her father, who was somewhat known, she was able to study at 3 academies: Paris, Amsterdam, and then Berlin, as well as in Vienna. Mostly it was in Paris and Amsterdam. The Berlin was just actually a very little bit. She audited these classes for the most part because she was not really allowed to attend as an enrolled student. At that time, in German academia especially, the teaching was that men were the creators and women were only useful as objects of the art. That sounds very old-fashioned to us today, and it's hard to believe, perhaps, but this was still true at the turn of the last century, into the 19 teens through the World War I years. And so Lina actually challenged this. And what she did is she took an ancient Roman poem by Lucius called The Gossip of the Courtesans, and she illustrated it. And this is an example of one of the illustrations. So you can see she did erotic portraits of women with other women, which was not so scandalous given this existed in the art world. But what was scandalous was she was a woman creating these images. That was a scandal. And it was such a scandal, there were protests outside the gallery. They had to close the gallery down for a while. This, by the way, was at the famous Gurlitt Gallery. You know, this is the same family that only a few years ago this hoard of treasure of looted art was discovered. It's the same family. And she went on, undeterred, and continued to do a number of erotic nudes of women. And as often happens, the scandal also produced a celebrity status of sorts. And so she actually became known more. And she soon had a very active life as a painter, as a home interior and business interior designer. She also was an illustrator in books and magazines. She ran her own fashion salon of clothes she designed. They did not live such a bad life in Berlin. She had met her husband, Ludwig Kainer, who is not Jewish, in Paris when she was studying there. He was a doctor, but he wanted to be an artist. And he actually ended up with a great gig where he was the stage decorator and the costume designer for the Ballet Russe. So she had married him as a student. Now they had moved to Germany, and he was the same thing for the Berlin Opera. So they had a very affluent life. I talked to his daughter by phone. She was telling me some interesting stories. For example, they would sometimes rent a whole floor of the Four Seasons Hotel in Berlin and have a big masquerade ball. So this was not, these were people who were living very well in Weimar, Berlin. One thing that happened, however, was Ludwig had a number of affairs that hurt Lina. And Lina, in the end, had an affair herself. And this affair brought about the end of her marriage in 1926. She began an affair with Bernhard Kellermann, who is a famous, at that time, was a very well-known German novelist. And because of this affair, you could say the divorce took place, and it hurt Lina deeply. She entered a depression. It's very clear in her diary. She was very sad. And I think she felt it was very difficult to start over. Bernhard Kellermann, as a famous writer at this time, received an offer from the Berliner Tageblatt, the big newspaper. They wanted him to follow the route of Marco Polo through Asia and to write feuilleton, you know, these small slice-of-life articles that would be sent back to Berlin and published in the newspaper. And he could bring with a small group of writers and artists with him, the artists to illustrate the stories. So naturally, he asked Lina if she wanted to go, and she said yes, she would go. They were also going to make a movie while they were there in Persia called In the Land of the Silver Lion, which was really a documentary about daily life in Persia at that time. So these were the two things they were going to do. So they set out. Oops, hold on. There. So they set out in 1926. They went from Berlin down to Trieste and took a boat to Venice. And now I'm going to read a little from her diary. December 10th, 1926. We are about to dock in Venice. The sea is calm, rippling slightly. The sun is lukewarm. Wonderful peace. Our ship creeps slowly and deliberately forward. My numbness begins to subside. I forget about all the disgust, all the depression, and surrender to everything yet to come. All the longing within me turns into prayer. If one has suffered, one has the right to rejoice again. Within a split second, with a beating heart and moist eyes, one feels reprieve. So I read that to mention the psychological difficulty and drama of the divorce. And on this journey, she's really looking, in a way, to recreate a new sense of self and to get over the pain of the divorce. And it comes up over and over within the diary. So they begin the journey, and on this journey, they take their time. You know, they're writing articles. When they get to a place, they sometimes stay a few weeks, but sometimes they stay a few months. They explore the area, they explore the food, the culture, they meet various people. They go to musical and theatrical events, and they write everything back that they've experienced. So this first part, they go by ship. They go from Italy through the islands of Greece, up to Istanbul, and then they're still on a ship, across the north coast of Turkey to Trabzon, which you see over there. And here in Trabzon, they land, and they spend some time. And Lina, clearly in her diary, is already very kind of fascinated and interested in being in the East, being in a more oriental environment, as one would say, especially at that time. She loves the bazaars. She loves the culture, the people, etc. So they go on through to Trabzon. They stay there a while, and then they take the train, and they go across Azerbaijan and Armenia. So going off the map towards the Caspian Sea. I have another map coming up. This is a man she painted while she was crossing Armenia. So now they are, it's probably easier if I use this. Well, I'll do my best. They, you see the Black Sea there, and you see the Caspian Sea. So they cross Azerbaijan, they reach the Caspian Sea at Baku, and they go down to what's Persia. Now it's Iran. And they land there in the town of Rashet. And then they go by car down into Tehran. And so Lina is fascinated. One thing I have to say about her, when she gets to a new place, she kind of forgets the old place very quickly. As soon as they land in Iran, she says it's like being in 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights. She describes the bazaars, the clothing of the people. She starts painting right away. This is a street scene somewhere in Persia. She doesn't say where. And they reach Tehran. And they stay in Tehran a few days. This is an actual street in Tehran in the 1920s. And then they decide to stay longer. They stay a few weeks in Tehran. And while they're there, they're writing, they're exploring, they're painting. She's getting ready. They're also getting ready to make this movie. And as part of this movie, they want to recreate a bride being sent to her new husband in an arranged marriage in Bandar Abbas, which is on the south coast of Iran. And they can't find a woman to play the part of the bride because it would be seen as improper culturally for women to play that part. So they ask Lina to play the part. So they dress her up as the Persian bride, and she is forced, She would say that herself, definitely, by the diary, to ride a camel through the deserts of Persia to Bandar Abbas. And so this trip, which also takes many weeks, leads them over the mountains to many stops at oases, small towns along the way. In the evening, they sleep in caravanserai, which are traditional places where caravans of camels or horses engaged in business stop and stay the night. Other people, travelers, also stay there. Sometimes also Muslim ascetics, like holy men, will sometimes renounce the world and will live and stay in these places as well. So she's in this environment, which also is, we shouldn't forget, is an all-male environment. She actually deals in some ways with this by playing down her femininity. She has her hair cut short for this trip, and she wears a kind of masculine clothes. We'll talk more about that. So this is from her diary after staying at a caravanserai. January 26th, 1927. We stopped in the dark at a caravanserai. We are shown into a large chamber of mud and stone. Ishmael and his brothers sleep in front of the door, wrapped in sheepskins. There is a fire in the chimney. I look around and am impressed by the simple decor and the various groups which are represented. Our chauffeur, a good-looking, dark and slim man of about 35, sporting a curly black beard, sits by the fire smoking an opium pipe. He beams at me, wide-eyed. Next to him, a soldier and two other similar types, not as handsome. A quiet, intelligent-looking young man is warming his hands by the fire. A beggar offers him a pipe which he has lit and started to smoke. I was invited to warm up by the chimney and was given the place of honor in the corner. Next to me, somebody is getting a shave and a haircut. In another corner, a meal is being prepared at the open fire for a Russian businessman traveling from Baghdad to Tehran. All in this architectural gem of a room with 4 large arches and many niches. In the middle, a small fountain. And then in the morning, she says, I am delighted with the architecture of the caravanserai, which is now fully visible. Heavenly quiet, magnificent colors. I climb up on a partly collapsed wall. Below, a beautiful garden with pomegranate trees and oleander. In the distance, the glistening sea. I am overwhelmed by this beautiful part of the world. It's very interesting, her romance, I think, for the East, quote unquote. She's coming, of course, from Berlin, which is a very modern city with its telephones and its cars and its all the trappings of modernity. And whether it's true or not, she's following, I think, a rather common trope of identifying in the Eastern lands, Asia, the Middle East, a more authentic, more simple life, uncorrupted by modernism. And this was a common feeling among Germans in the 1920s at that time. And in fact, it had been something that had been within German culture since the mid-19th century, if not before. They now reach Bandar Abbas, which is on the south, which is the south of Iran, at the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. She does a lot of paintings there. They stay there many weeks. The one on the left is a woman, and maybe with a servant. You can see her face. And the one on the right is a man wearing a sarong, which is a traditional kind of clothing for that area of Iran, partly because there's a lot of pearl divers. He's probably a pearl diver. She was fascinated with watching the pearl divers. And the woman is wearing a mask, which is common in that area of South Iran. And I actually put a picture of a woman wearing that same mask today, just so you could make out what that was. So the trip continues. I think I can describe this from here. They're at Bandar Abbas by the Gulf of Oman, and they go on there by boat along that coast to Karachi, then India, now Pakistan. And what they're going to do is they're going to go towards the upper right into the Himalayas. They take a train from Karachi to Lahore, and then from Lahore, they take a train a little bit farther to, well, actually a lot farther, I should say, really, to Srinagar, which is the largest city in Kashmir. She loves Lahore. She talks about Lahore a lot, and she says the people, in this way I was describing earlier about idealizing the Asian world, she describes the people of Lahore as very beautiful, with beautiful clothing and a fine sense of style and elegance that is somewhat missing in the West. She talks a lot about the buildings, and also she spends a lot of time talking about the buildings where these swallows are flying through the buildings and building nests everywhere. It's a beautiful description. When they get up to Srinagar, they're already they're already getting up into the Himalayas now. And in Srinagar, they rent a houseboat. And they're going to use the houseboat to use the river system based along the Indus River to keep going up, up, up into the Himalayas as far as they can by boat, which is to Ganderbal. This is a photo of Srinagar today. There's a culture of houseboats and bazaars on boats there. And this is also a trip with a lot of style. They have a very nice houseboat they're going on with a lot of private rooms in the houseboat. They have another boat attached to it that's just the kitchen, and then a third boat for servants and staff. So this isn't like a kind of roughing it trip so far. They continue on. These are paintings and drawings she did in Ganderbal. Kind of a scene of a house in the woods and a man playing a sitar. From here on, they can't follow the rivers. The current is too strong. Coming down from the Himalayas, and they get horses, and they start a long and arduous trek up the mountains that takes many, many weeks, going into months, actually. And they're going up into the mountains. They're seeing fewer and fewer people. There's the Indian hill stations, some colonial outposts, some smaller villages, but it's becoming a lot more desolate. Here they are, or not here they are literally, but this is a picture of where they ended up, which is in the region of Ladakh, which is in India, high up in the Himalayas, almost as far as you can go. I mean, without really being an explorer. They still have their servants and stuff, but the trip is much more arduous. But she describes the beauty of what she sees on the way. She continues to paint. And one thing she's really getting into is visiting Buddhist monasteries. This is a monastery she painted. She loved visiting the Buddhist monasteries, the convents, talking to the lamas, the priests, the nuns, the villagers nearby as well. She becomes really interested in Buddhism, initially from this artistic perspective, but also increasingly from a spiritual perspective. Here are some Buddhist priests that she painted. And this is a, thank you. And this is another piece she did, which is basically a map of all the Buddhist monasteries and shrines that she's seen as she goes. So it really becomes a trip about visiting these places for her. Then they finally reach Leh in northern India, and they stay there and use that as a home base. It's a large provincial city, to continue to go out and explore the mountains, and especially all the religious sites, both Hindu and Buddhist and Muslim as well. This is a woman that she painted when she was there. They stay there many months, and this is where her interest in Buddhism really grows. Then, in the spring, they decide to come down from the mountains. They've spent the winter in Leh Ladakh. They start coming down. Again, it's an arduous trip by horse. It takes many, many weeks, actually a month or two. And they end up in Jaipur on more the central Indian continent. And then they land in Agra. And here they decide to stop this kind of wandering. And they're going to rent a house. And they're going to live in Agra for many months and really explore India. This is a woman in Agra that she painted. She did a lot of artwork in Agra. Now, one thing she wanted to do, because she was very interested in the ancient Asian world, for lack of a better word, I'm using this term loosely, she wanted to paint a dancing girl, a traditional Indian dancing girl. These were women who performed for the aristocracy, for emperors, and they also both music, dances, even in a theatrical way. They were also courtesans historically. But by the time Lina is there, they have pretty much been relegated to the status of regular prostitution. She still wants to paint a real dancing girl, not a fake person dressed up as a dancing girl. She's on the search for this authenticity. So she can't really go into a brothel because it would be unseemly for a woman to be in a brothel, and it'd be unseemly for a woman in a brothel to be hired by another woman. So she does what she sometimes does, which is she goes in drag. She dresses as a man, which she has done already on this trip, because it provides her access to places where women normally can't go, temples, holy sites in particular, but also in Persia, certain markets and bazaars, as well as in Lahore. There were places she couldn't go. So she always has had her hair cut short for this trip. And she binds her breasts, and she dresses in a very masculine way. There's a better image of this in the case right here. It turned out a little dark in the slideshow. With the help of someone, a guide, she's able to visit a brothel, and she hires a girl to paint for her, and she describes that experience of being in the brothel, painting this girl. So Agra, and it's November 1927, which shows how long they've stayed in India. Many months they have been living in Agra. I've painted Chuma twice today, before and after lunch. Irritated by the cacophony in the house and the sad beauty of the girl. When I arrived this morning, she already had or still has a male visitor. Shape of a boxer, a square figure with greasy hairdo, scrawny bowed legs. Incidentally, he stayed all day, including the afternoon. Either he is an official who spends his vacation here, or he has a subscription, or he is the bouncer during rush hour. While I was sitting around waiting for her to put on her dance costume, there was a steady flow of men. A doctor, a policeman, those and several non-paying hangers-on. I was an obvious nuisance in her daily affairs and was afforded a horrible impression of what was demanded of the poor girl. Several cousins appeared in various stages of dress, undress, all of them dirty. Through the door, which opened and closed constantly, I saw a girl in bed and a fat old geezer lifting the blanket and stroking her. 3 guys sitting on the floor playing cards. 2 chubby girls with pointed breasts gossiping, 12 or 14 years old. At the end of the bed sat a well-groomed, spoiled 16 or 17-year-old Indian boy. Most likely, I interrupted his pleasure session with chuma. Everybody was chewing betel and spitting the residue into a brass kettle in the middle of the room. Chuma's mother, a woman of 35 who looks like 50, has 10 children and knows none of their fathers. Chuma was dressed in her 20-pound, cobalt blue, gold-embroidered dancing gown, a turquoise-hued embroidered little jacket, a light pink covering robe, and all her jewelry. She appeared strange, and I preferred her unadorned, still interesting and beautiful. I worked several hours. She must be quite ill. Her waist is frighteningly skinny, and her bare skin is wilted and yellow. Poor, devastated creature. The whole family marvels at her, adores her, and serves her. While I'm painting, a large monkey jumps from the roof onto the terrace. He, too, is curious to see what is going on. They stay in India, and they go to Benares, which is on the river Ganges. This is a painting of all the pilgrims that she sees going down to the Ganges River to bathe. And what she finds really moving about being in Benares are the cremations of believing Hindus. And she actually really finds them very beautiful. And she goes down to the river to watch the cremations. And she's so moved by the beauty of it, the flowers, the fire, the rituals around it, how the family reacts. And she says in her diary, watching these cremations makes me want to become a Buddhist or a Hindu. This is a scene today in Benares. So the time has come now to move on. And they go on a boat from Calcutta. They go across up to Rangoon in Burma and then down to the bottom right and around the tip of Malaysia. And they do this all slowly by boat, stopping at many places, painting, observing, exploring everything on the way. And then they land in what is today Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, to use the modern terms. And they stay in this area now for many, many months. They spend a lot of time in the cities. And Lina, actually, very interesting, she was less involved in this up to now, but something about the theater in Thailand she finds really beautiful and inspiring. And she starts going to a lot of theater in Thailand. Local, regional theater, we're talking in small villages. They rent a boat, they go up the Mekong River, deep into the hinterland. They visit a number of villages where the houses are on poles in the water, and they largely attend a lot of religious and theatrical festivities, which she writes about. And she loves Thailand. As usual, India quickly leaves her mind, and she is also excited because here she says in her diary she feels the true China beginning. This has always been kind of a goal to get as far east, as far away from Europe, in a sense, as possible. So here's a little girl she painted, well, in Thailand or Cambodia or Laos, I think in what's now Thailand. A woman she painted, I think, oops, I shouldn't do that so fast. A woman she painted, and I think this next painting is the same woman, and this woman was an actress, because she describes in part of her diary a place she attends where the women are all sitting like this in costumes like this. This is also a woman in a theatrical production in rural Thailand. Two women at a market in what is now Laos. She's still very interested in Buddhism. She talks about in her diary, they go to a lot of Buddhist shrines and many Buddhist temples. One thing interesting she notes is that in many places when they get there, many times she sees only the feet of the Buddha because thieves have hacked the statue off at the foot and have taken it away to probably sell on the art market for money. And it was very interesting because I saw this statue at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And it actually has that. So I wonder if Lina saw only the feet or if she was lucky enough to see the whole thing still when she was there in Thailand. And I know this one is from Thailand. So after spending many months, it's spring of 1928, and they go to what was then Saigon, modern Ho Chi Minh City, and they catch a boat, and they go up the coast to China. And now this is her writing about Shanghai. And Shanghai was a different experience because it was much more cosmopolitan in some ways and Western. The music we were playing before this talk was actually jazz music from the 1920s in Shanghai. Shanghai, April 10th, 1928. Broad, dirty yellow river. Many big steamers smoking. In between, countless junks. At night, skyscrapers electrically lit top to bottom. Chinatown colorful, spectacular, crowded. For the first time, a true Chinese atmosphere. It is the cold season. Everybody walking around puffed up in padded jackets and pants. The children are walking colorful birds, round, chubby, brownish red faces, fabulous hairstyles, the little braids colorfully adorned in the most unlikely places. Should they be called away from this world suddenly, the angels have something to grab onto and can pull them into heaven by their braids. That's their purpose. The strand of hair on the back of a Hindu skull serves the same purpose. Everything's a chaotic mix. Big city with a dash of old China. I'm beat and dizzy. Chinese restaurants serve 23 courses, all superb. During the meal, we are offered hot towels to clean off. Sing-song girls, pretty, poor, quaint. Later, the brothel. She goes to the brothel with the people she's wished. Impoverished, sad, unoriginal. The girls working there are well-bred and embarrassed. My German companions exhibit fewer virtues than me. I take a purely optical interest, which actually is interesting, right? We have to remember she's with these men, and of course these men act out sexually in the brothels. She's with them, dressed as a man, watching this. Gambling dens, interesting types. A Chinese movie with English subtitles. It was so sweet and genuine. So was the audience. The Chinese are creative and interesting and refreshing to deal with. They always maintain their sense of humor. I am sorry I can't really communicate with them, though it sounds like she is, right? They can't really project themselves with a few bits of English. Only our mutual sensitivity is helpful. I'm making tentative efforts to work, but I am rather weak. Now, she was getting weak because she had contracted dysentery on the trip. And so she was doing what she could to try and overcome it. This is a painting from Shanghai. You see the braids. A Chinese boy. A street scene somewhere in China. This could also be in Beijing. She ended up going to, the group went to Beijing from Shanghai, and they stayed there many months again. And Lina continued to go to a lot of theater. She visited a lot of the historical sites, such as the Forbidden City, but she also went to a lot of Buddhist shrines, the Peking Opera, and the museums. During this time, it's good to note that she also went in the hospital because of dysentery, and she was in the hospital many weeks, but she did recover. But it was very tough going, and of course the medical care was not the kind she was used to, and so she found the hospital a place of poverty and difficulty. But she said the people who worked there and the other patients were very beautiful, wonderful, noble people. This scene here is girls at the Peking Opera. She's very interested in going to the opera. There's on the triptych, the thing on the left is an actor. actress of the Peking Opera. The opera is actually, it's always men performing, so the women's parts are performed by men. She painted that while at the opera. But now, another thing that's happening is she is beginning to see more and more refugees coming into Beijing, and that is because Chiang Kai-shek and his army are approaching the city. It's during the Chinese Civil War. So there's soon rumors that they will have to leave. They'll forcibly be evacuated. But Lina also says she's ready to go home. She's been away now for a long time, and she's ready to go back to Berlin, see her son. She has a son from her marriage, to be reunited with him and to pick up where she left off. So one day, they board a train with the help of Chinese authorities because the end is quite close as far as the war. They've surrounded Beijing. And they go on the Trans-Siberian Railway all the way back to Europe. A long trek. They have a stop in Moscow where they stay a while. Lina says they basically gave all their clothing away because the people were so poor because of the difficulties under the new Marxist regime. They get back, so she gets back to Berlin. This photograph is probably a press photograph used and taken to publicize the trip in the Berliner Tageblatt. So, what happens to Lene Schneider-Kainer? First of all, we don't know about what happens between her in her relationship with Bernhard Kellermann, if it remained romantic through the trip. We do know he stayed behind in Asia. He went and spent a year in Japan. And he continued to write. And so we just don't know what that relationship had become. Lina comes back, and she picks up her old life as a single woman. But of course, now it's getting closer and closer to the time the Nazis take power. And in 1933, she leaves the country for good. She already had gone to explore Spain. And she opens a small hotel in Spain in Ibiza, which becomes a kind of artist colony. And later, Bernhard Kellermann comes and joins her there. But I don't know, again, if this was romantic or not. Her son also joins her there. They live there for many years. Then the Spanish Civil War breaks out. The hotel is bombed. Peter stays there in Spain. And I don't know exactly, but I'm guessing perhaps fighting against the Franco regime, like many people volunteered to do on the political left. She comes to New York, and she lives here in Manhattan, and she works as a book illustrator, actually. And she is an inventor of the cloth book for babies. So the baby can chew it or spit on it or whatever, and the book is not destroyed. So she works producing a number of these first books under the name Aleska. Sounds quite dramatic. At the end of the war, she finds out her son, who was sent back to Germany, survived in hiding. And in hiding, he also was with a wife and now a child. And they had all survived. So she's very happy about that, and she wants them to come join her in New York. So they're going to come to New York, but things do not work out in that way because apparently the American consul, the Allies, ask so many questions that Peter gets upset with them and says, if you ask me all these questions, you're like the Nazis. Well, and then that's the end of him coming to America. So Lina finds out, and she calls friends in Bolivia. She has friends in Bolivia, and she says, I can't believe it. They can't get out because my son was in this argument now, and they won't let him out. And they said, well, would he want to come to Bolivia? He can come and live here. Okay, great. So he ends up moving with his wife and child to Bolivia. She stays in New York, And then in the 1950s, she decides to leave New York and to go and live with them in a house nearby that I think they built for her in Cochabamba, Bolivia. So she goes to Bolivia and she's reunited with her family. But it's not that she didn't leave behind an interesting life in New York. She had actually had a show in 1947 at the Brooklyn Museum, not of her artwork, but of artwork she collected while on her trip around India, which also shows the amount of shopping she had managed to do, which is often also discussed in her diary. Lots of shipping things back. But obviously valuable, important things. So in Bolivia, the story is still not done, because what she does is she works organizing native indigenous women of Bolivia into cooperatives for weaving native textiles. And she calls this cooperative the Andean Company. And it becomes a very successful company with many branches, selling hand-woven native textiles of Bolivia. And she stays in Bolivia until her death in 1971. And today, her family members can be found in Guatemala, in Germany, some in the southern United States, in Florida, and one in Brooklyn. In conclusion, I wanted just to say I'm impressed by many aspects of her life and what she did, the obstacles that she overcame as an artist, as a woman, and also how she was able to reinvent herself over and over as a refugee once Hitler took power. Another thing she did, but I don't know when she did this, because it does not say in her diary, but she ended up converting to Buddhism. And she remained loyal to Buddhism all her life. Her granddaughter, who knew her very well, told me that she was a teetotaler, she never smoked, and she followed Buddhist practice and belief. She also, another interesting thing is she also always kept her hair cut short. She always wore kind of trousers and more masculine clothing, which even in the Bolivia of the 1950s was quite a statement. So she certainly was not playing up an idea of femininity for anyone. I wanted to also, with this talk, to let people know about this as an example of many of the treasures we have at the Leo Baeck Institute and at the Center of Jewish History. I hope you take time to explore them and what we have. She's just one of many stories here. And I hope you have found her life as interesting and as engaging as I did. Thank you. So now we'll take questions. Judy here has a microphone, so she'll walk around. And does anyone have any questions or comments? There's one over there.
Two questions. Is this on? I have two questions. First, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. The first question is, did she have any association or any Jewish relatives who survived her? And the other thing is, in her diaries, that she mentioned the adjustment that must have gone on from a cosmopolitan New York to the backwoods in Bolivia.
Her diary actually is only her Asian trip, so we don't know what she thought about Bolivia, I'm afraid. That's a mystery. And I didn't quite hear the first, but Judy, can you say it again? Or
I asked whether she had any Jewish surviving relatives.
Oh, no, I'm unsure. The archival material we have about her doesn't mention other members of the family, actually.
How did her collection end up here?
It was
she
given.
died in Bolivia.
It was given by the family in the 1960s. Lina herself gave it to us. Now, my feeling, and I asked the family about this, but they were not totally sure either, But my feeling is that she had left some of that artwork here in New York when she went to Bolivia, and it was in the care of friends, a man named Dr. Glazer. Because I see in the records, it says gifts given by Lene Schneider-Kainer and Dr. Glazer. So that's my theory. And she gave it here instead of bringing it with her to Bolivia. I could be wrong about that, but it seems unlikely they would bring all this stuff back to the United States. And she, is very connected in New York, actually.
Were most of her works in watercolors, or did she do some oils also?
I didn't quite hear. Sorry. Oh, okay. She rarely did oil, but she would sometimes do oil for portraits, especially in the 1920s. So we don't have any here, but she was hired a lot to do portraits of significant figures in Weimar, Berlin. And I think one of her most famous portraits she did is a poet named Elsa Lasker-Schuler, who was also a feminist in her own way, and very much actually attached to her Jewish identity. And I think they were friends because they ran together in these artistic circles, and they dressed somewhat similar with this kind of, for lack of a better word, Oriental flair. And both were fascinated with the idea of the East. Elsa Lasker-Schuler was especially fascinated with it as a Jewish woman because she said that her blood was the blood of the Arab people, the ancient Asian Hittites, the Babylonians. And she actually often would dress in drag as an Egyptian prince named Joseph of Thebes. And she would go into the cafes in Berlin dressed like this and, smoking. And, she had a little dagger with her that she had made purposely based on an Egyptian bas relief at a museum in Berlin. So she was quite the character, and she would take on that persona, especially when she met young Jewish writers from Eastern Europe in the cafes, and she would say, "Our blood is the same. We both have the blood of Moses and the blood of the Pharaoh," and you can imagine. But she was a very well-known poet in her day, and she's had many revivals over the years. I love her poetry, so I can say it's beautiful. Yes? Oh, sorry, I guess there's one back here first.
I was curious. It was so great to hear the talk, and I was curious, like, a little bit more about if you had any thoughts about what specifically would have inspired her to travel in Asia outside of a sort of prevailing Orientalism in the air. And one of the reasons I asked is because when you were telling her story, I was reminded of Isabel Eberhardt, who is a Swiss woman who died when she was 27, also traveled around Asia, also cross-dressed, also converted to Islam, and eventually changed her name. I mean, we wouldn't have heard the whole story, and now you talked about this poet just now. So it's just making me think about what other strands.
Yeah, a lot of it actually is, I think, is about ideas of race in the 19th century and early 20th century. I think that in the world of modernism in Europe, people in Europe often look towards the of Asia as a more authentic, original homeland which sounds strange to us, that they had all not exactly once belonged to, but could relate with. Like I remember, even when I was in school, we learned about how the European people had come from the Indus River Valley, and they were called Aryans, and they went, north into Europe and so on. And this was like the 1980s. and I think that there was an idea of an of Asia as for some people, for artists, as other groups too, as a kind of place of origin. As strange as that sounds, it was a romantic idea. It was a romantic idea, I would say. But I think also, I mean, she was looking as well for a different experience. So I hope that answers it. It's not so exact, but it's a big topic.
I'm struck by, I know that the time she spent in Paris, I'm wondering if she had contact with Matisse, and I'm thinking of Leon Baeck, the costume designer.
Yeah.
And also Delacroix. You know, there's a lot of similarity in that kind of almost ethnographic, you know, kind of recording, but on a very high artistic level. Did she have any contact with
Yes, she did have contact with a lot of artists who were in Paris at the time. That's true. And she was part of the cafe cultural scene. There were a lot of Germans, actually, who were living in Paris, who were artists, and she was part of that culture. They met at a certain cafe, I think the Cafe Odeon, and so she particularly knew the German artists, but there was a lot of cross-transference culturally.
And when are you going to do the catalog?
Well, we'll have to talk to everyone else at Leo Baeck.
So I think we have time for one more question.
I have two questions. One is, in their lengthy travels all the way through Asia, etc., did they send dispatches back to any journals, or how did people?
They did, and people read these articles faithfully in the Berliner Tageblatt. They published her artwork, they published her article, or they published Bernard Kellerman's articles along with them. And I didn't use any examples tonight, but we have a scrapbook of a lot of those in the archival collection as well.
And how were they financed? Who financed this huge?
The Berliner Tageblatt.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, the newspaper itself. The publishing house for the newspaper, the Mossy Verlag. Okay, thank you. I think there's refreshments. Perfect.